2010-2011 Nixon Fellow Melissa Samarin. Melissa is a senior in the Whittier Scholars program with a double major in international policy and Russian culture in a global context. In addition to being the Nixon Fellow, Melissa is a member of numerous honor societies and is the Whittier College nominee for the Marshall Scholarship. Melissa will be attending graduate school next year, although she doesn't know exactly where yet, so she needs to pick from amongst the schools that she's been accepted to. Tonight, Melissa will be sharing about her research on Nixon's legacy on human rights. To complete this project, Melissa has spent the year interning with the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and spent the summer of 2010 studying in Russia, of which she's fluent. Please help me in welcoming the 2010 Nixon Fellow, Melissa Samarin.
Okay, well, first of all, everyone, thank you for coming. I wanted to thank, obviously, the college for giving me this generous grant that I used to the best of my ability. My project was a three-part project. Oops, not ready. Three-part project basically involved me. I studied abroad in Russia for the summer. I came back, interned, and then the third part of my project was independent research on Nixon and human rights. And it all ties in together, believe it or not. So this is just sort of an overview of my trip to St. Petersburg. I have a couple of slides about the places around the city that I really enjoyed, and some funny shots as well. Two reasons I went to Russia was, first of all, to study primarily. I grew up speaking the language, but being a conversational speaker and a grammatical speaker are two different things. I really wanted that base and that language base, and then also to get a cultural perspective on the country in a contemporary sense. I made a lot of really good friends while I was there, got to experience a lot. Did have an extended trip to Moscow where we saw this Red Square, and it was unfortunately extremely hot while I was there, but I got to see, I think, some amazing treasures of Russian culture with my favorite, St. Basil's Cathedral. So, but I did live in St. Petersburg. That was where I was stationed. This is my apartment where I lived. I lived with a host family. This is a map of St. Petersburg, and I lived way, way down south. This was the metro station right by my house. My apartment building was this building right here that you see. It's actually inside, but it was a relatively modern area and a very nice area. That's my apartment building straight ahead. I lived with a host family. This was the elevator I had to take to my house every day. It was a little scary, but that was kind of one of the funny things about Russia. It's modern, but the houses are tiny, and it's really just sort of has these really odd idiosyncrasies that I got really used to living. For instance, that was my bed with the Turkish rug on top. It was a very interesting living experience. But it did have a balcony, and there was a lovely little garden on it. This was the view from my balcony. There was always little kids playing out there. I was there during white night, so it was basically light for, I don't know, a bunch of hours per day. This was my host mom. She was quite a tough woman, but I ended up learning a lot from her, so I do miss her. She was very hospitable to me. But like I said, my primary goal in going there was to study at St. Petersburg State University, Smolny Institute, which was the headquarters for the Political Science and the International Relations Department. It was about an hour from my house. You could see back on the map. I mean, my house was way, way down south. It took me about an hour to get to school every day, and I went every day. My classes, this is my school, by the way, I actually think is absolutely gorgeous. It's an old convent that was turned into a school. I went to classes 5 days a week. They were all in Russian. That's the name of our school right there. The opening to my school, these were the hallways. It was really beautiful inside the classrooms. They were small. I was somehow or another placed in the highest level Russian. These were our teachers on the last day, and some of the good friends that I made. I was placed in the highest level class. It was intense, to say the least. It was a Russian language immersion program, and when we weren't in class, we were on academic experiences outside of class. I also did quite well in classes, which was really rewarding for me because the finals were ridiculously hard. But it was, I learned learned a lot, and to the point where I came back and was having a hard time speaking English again. But one of the perks about studying at the school is that I got an opportunity to do a lot of extracurricular things to enhance my trip. And one of the things was I was able to intern at the Hermitage, which is one of the largest art museums in the world. It houses some of, the most amazing masterpieces in the world, and it's the old Winter Palace that's transformed into an art museum now. So this was right there on the edge of the river. This is the Winter Palace from the river. I interned with, this was the head of well, he's basically the head, the man in the center is the head of the Hermitage, and the two people standing next to him are two interns that I worked with. These were two other intern girls that I worked with. The office where I went every day and worked and stationed. This was my first post as the job. We had a big event that I helped to coordinate, and there's me on the job. I was really excited with my badge. And then these are just some of the amazing, and this one right here, I'm sorry, that looks really funny, but this is actually the only Michelangelo in Russia, and they're very proud of that sculpture. And these are just some of the pieces of artwork and rooms that are in the Hermitage. I was also stationed at the information desk, and this is actually an archaeological find, and some of the treasures of, this is Peter the Great's throne, some of the libraries that are in there, the altars, and the white auditorium, which was my favorite. While I was there, I actually was stationed at the information desk and was giving tourists all sorts of information on where to go, which was interesting because I kept getting lost every time I was in the Hermitage. But it was an experience, to say the least. And one of the nice things was that I had a badge, and I was always able to bypass all the lines whenever I wanted to go to the Hermitage, because if anyone has ever been there, the lines are literally out the door and down the street to get inside. But it was nothing to do with my Nixon project, but it was definitely an academically enhancing experience. The next thing that I was able to do was to volunteer teach English with a linguistics center. So this, once again, was very far from where I lived, but this was the center where I taught, and this was the class that I worked with. I have it just on. The class that I worked with, they were awesome students. It gave me a really good perspective. I got to meet a lot of friends with the people, and gave me really good insight on how to teach English, basically be a conversation partner. But I did that once a week as well. And then finally, the last thing, and this really relates to my project, was I was able to go to the Russian National Library, which houses basically all of the important works of literature and documents in Russia. It's in St. Petersburg. It survived everything, including the siege and all sorts of fires, because they're really proud of this library, to the point where about 5 years ago, you weren't allowed into it unless you had a degree and a recommendation from a professor. But they've changed a lot of things in the government, and now, as long as you have a student ID, which I had, you can apply for a ID card and get access to the library. So that was something huge. I was the only student out of my program to do this, because you have to jump through enormous amounts of red tape, but I did, and I have the library card, and I was actually able to go into the library, which is right here on the main street. You have no idea it's there, except that when you're pointed out that here's the door of the library, I walked in all the time. I was able to take a tour of the Voltaire vault, which is what he donated to Catherine the Great. These are just some photos from it. Otherwise, you weren't allowed to take pictures inside, so I unfortunately don't have any. But one of the things I was able to do was get copies of some of the documents. Whoops. So these are actually photocopies of documents that I was able to make photocopies of. And there's my ID card and a receipt from the copies that I made, because Russians are notorious for bureaucracy and red tape, like I said, and it was literally a 30-minute process to get a single copy. But I did, and it was really neat just to be amidst all those old books, and it was kind of rewarding. I didn't end up using any of the documents in my research, because my research took a slightly different turn, but it was nonetheless an amazing part of my study abroad experience. So, amidst everything else that I did while I was there, when I returned, I began an internship at the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Previously, the Nixon Library was a private library that just housed political documents pertaining to his political work as a senator and everything when he wasn't president. But in 2007, amidst much controversy, it was finally transferred over to be a presidential library officially. So they began shipping all the documents and materials from Washington, D.C. to the Rebel Window headquarters. it took months and months, and the very last shipment arrived in June of 2010, and I began my internship in September of 2010. So amidst this enormous project, there were so many things out of catalog or out of order that weren't recorded, that weren't cataloged, and they suddenly needed a whole new slew of interns. So it was perfect timing for me to come into this. This is the Nixon Library for those of you who haven't been there, and that's the new logo on the bottom, which has also received quite a bit of controversy, but I don't know, I like it. This is me actually interning. This was on one of the days that they were having a big event. There's tons of big events always going on right now. They just had a recent Watergate exhibit open up. And basically my work has been pretty influential in that. I was originally in the document section, but after a few weeks of it, they asked me to transfer over to the audio and visual department. So the big project that I've been put on is there's 2 sets of master print files that have literally every single official photo ever taken during Nixon's presidency. And there's literally thousands of them, and there are 2 sets of these files. So my job is to go through, catalog them, and this is just one of the filing cabinets that has them. I go through and catalog them, I record them in the database, I make sure that they're in the right order, in the right place, by subject, by year, by chronological order. It's a very labor-intensive job, and for a while, and if I had internet I would show you guys, I apologize, but for a while I thought this was the most mundane job ever, until I went on the website and realized that the majority of they kept asking me, oh, which pictures do you like, which pictures do you like? And I found that they were using some of those for their website. So it's actually kind of neat to see that. As well as you're able to now order all of those images online and get copies of them because they're now public documents because it's a presidential library. So all of this that I've been working on has actually been beneficial to researchers and anyone interested in the Nixon presidency. So I would show you these, but I don't think they actually have, there's no internet, unfortunately. But you're welcome to look on the website, just browse around, you'll see pictures on the corner, and that's most likely a picture that I've held and handled and cataloged to some extent. So these are the recent developments at the Nixon Library. The Watergate exhibit, like I just talked about, is this huge new exhibit that they just opened up, and it's actually been quite exciting to work down there, even though it's about 60 degrees in the archives where I work, so it's usually very, very cold. But it's also given me an opportunity to get a hold of some of the documents from the Nixon presidency, and I actually used these in my research and in my research paper. And also, what it helped me to do was to get a hold of a lot of the images, and I know the phrase, one picture holds 1,000 words, and I've literally been handling hundreds of these, so I feel like I have a very complete history of Nixon's presidency by now. But what my research basically centered upon was Nixon's legacy on human rights, because I'm really interested, first of all, in Russia, obviously, but also in human rights and the effect that he had on it. And I found that there is actually a correlation between Nixon's foreign policy and the human rights in international negotiations during the Cold War. So just as some background, Nixon was actually talking about pursuing détente for quite some time. Détente is referring to the thawing of relations between the United States and Soviet Union. And he wrote about it extensively. Some of the documents I got from the Nixon Library basically prove that he said we need to have an innovative, new approach to our foreign policy. And at a similar time, he had obviously inherited the war in Vietnam, so he was feeling pressure to try to utilize innovative foreign policies with his Secretary of State, Kissinger. And the Soviet Union, meanwhile, had been undergoing a certain amount of development as well. They had been wanting to try to promote cooperation with the United States. So in 1969, the Soviet ambassador Dobrynin came over, talked with Kissinger, and proposed this idea of having a meeting between the two heads of state. It was followed up in all of 69, 70, into 71. They kept sending over different, Dobrynin and Gromyko, who was one of the foreign ministers, kept coming over, talking to Nixon and Kissinger, and finally, at the end of 1971, a date was set upon. Nixon had already agreed to go to China, but in February, but he established the date in May to come visit the Soviet Union, and that was monumental. I actually argue in my paper that it was even more monumental than China because of the lasting effect that it had on the Cold War climate at the time. So Nixon arrived, oh actually, if I can just go back for 1 second. This is actually a photo. These are some of the documents that I've been working with. This is actually a photo of Dobrynin and Nixon, you can see here, in the White House discussing, one of the discussions, the rounds of talks that they had of him coming to, of Nixon coming to Moscow. So this is one of those pre-meeting sessions. But in May 20th, 1972, Nixon arrived in Russia. He was the very first American president to come to the Russian capital while in office, and here he is with his wife arriving. It was a huge, huge deal. But meanwhile, back while all this is happening, while he's discussing détente talks with Brezhnev and his foreign ministers, there was a huge human rights movement evolving within Russia that not very many people know about. In fact, I didn't until I began this project. The human rights movement was sort of embodied within the dissident movement. It's just sort of labeled as a dissident movement. It covered religious, democratic, ethnic, nationalist, and human rights movements in Russia because of the nature of Soviet society that didn't really allow for people to publicly organize. They were these fragmented movements that sort of developed independently, but eventually molded into one huge movement. The human rights movement in particular began in 1965, December 5th. There was a protest on the Kremlin where someone shouted out the words "social rights for the Constitution," and this was apparently so heinous of a claim that the protest was squelched, and after that people really began identifying with a human rights movement. So that goes to show you a little bit about Soviet society, where saying those words could result in huge repercussions. Essentially what the human rights movement was based on was a freedom of speech. That's what people wanted. That's basically all they wanted at first, was just freedom of speech. And there was two main professions that were affected by this, the writers and the scientists, because without freedom of speech, you can't really complete those jobs to their fullest intent. So there was two men in particular. If anyone has studied Soviet studies, you may have come across these names, Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They were a prominent scientist and a prominent writer, and they really spearheaded this movement in helping to establish it and spearhead it. And with their prominence, because it was an elitist movement and these men knew it, it was basically writers, scientists, and professionals. It wasn't a mass mobilized movement, but it was that exclusivity that really kept it propelled, because they were able to stay away from Soviet authorities intervening and sending them off to labor camps and mental institutions and anything else that they did. They also had several underground presses that they would publish these human rights violations, and they too were able to remain anonymous and never were infiltrated by the KGB. But they were never able to be a publicly organized human rights and civil rights movement. At first, Brezhnev was pretty lenient on this, and he just let them go. He didn't really have much arrests of them. But as time evolved and he knew that Nixon was coming, he actually really started to crack down on a lot of these dissidents. So as Nixon is arriving in Moscow, there were hundreds and hundreds of these people being persecuted, sent to labor camps, in some instances actually killed, and it was sort of left under the radar of all these détente talks. But Nixon comes to Moscow, and one of the many things that they talked about was a round of agreements. They actually signed 2 SALT documents, which were nuclear arms limitation agreements, and 9 other documents relating to policies of détente and how the two countries would mutually cooperate and treat each other. And this is Nixon in the Kremlin speaking with Brezhnev, who's on this side of the table. And this was when they first met on, I think it was May 22nd, when they actually first met in the Kremlin. Like I said, they signed 11 different documents and agreed on a conference for security and cooperation in Europe at this meeting. And this was actually Nixon and Brezhnev signing those documents. I don't know if this is the SALT document or the basic principles of mutual relations document, but here they are actually signing this hugely monumental piece of legislation in Moscow. But like I also referenced, they also talked about establishing a conference for extending this to other European nations, a sense of cooperation. So from 1972 to 1975, there were a series more of rounds of talks, including 35 nations, including the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This was actually a follow-up thing where Brezhnev sent over this boat as a thank you to Nixon for coming over, and this is Gromyko giving Kissinger the keys to it. It was sort of their parting gift. But Brezhnev also came back to the White House either once or twice, I can't remember. This is him in the White House discussing with Nixon about those follow-up talks of cooperation in Europe. This is the first picture that they're actually discussing, and this second picture I just like because of the mirror in the back. They're at a party afterwards, enjoying themselves and toasting to, I hope, a good round of agreements. For other reasons, Nixon was not ever able to see the final act come to fruition, but in May 1st, 1975, they actually signed the summit, or the Helsinki Documents. It's called the Helsinki Accords because it took place in Helsinki, Finland, and was a huge human rights document. It basically established how people should treat each other, how governments should treat their citizens, and was worded in such a way that both the United States and Soviet Union were okay with signing on to it, which is a huge deal in the Cold War when human rights were notoriously violated. It was an opportunity for people to address human rights. They did so, and this also gave the Soviet dissidents who were being continually repressed by their government an opportunity to speak out, and it's from this summit that the first human rights organizations were actually established in Russia, the first one being the Moscow Helsinki Group. Since then, there have been dozens more. The Moscow Helsinki Group is still active today, especially with stuff in Chechnya. They work in cooperation with other organizations, but it's still a huge issue in Russia. Human rights are not very well respected, and so this has been one of the big lasting legacies of this time period. And I don't want to say that Nixon was absolutely responsible for this creation, but he certainly had a linkage to it because it was because of his détente policies, his foreign policies, that led to this chain reaction of positive relations that allowed for these series of negotiations to happen and essentially allowed for human rights to be put on the radar of the international agenda during the Cold War. So this has been a year-long endeavor for me. I've spent a lot of time on it. I feel like I've gotten a great academic experience out of it. It was an amazing way to spend my last year of college, traveling and interning and being able to do this research. So I do want to thank the college for this opportunity and thank everyone for coming today to listen to it. So thank you.